Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's my question for today. What are new ways that we can try to connect with each other? Again, quite a big question, and again, we're talking about connection because today we're continuing our conversation with Bart and Terry about their current project, What Now? Canaries in Camo. This is an issue that affects all of us, the lives and stories of veterans and the way we relate to them. And that's more of what we're going to talk about today with Bart and Terry, their experiences and some of the hopes they have about new ways of connecting with each other. So let's jump back in with Bart and Terry. Bart, I'm curious, not to put you on the spot. Can you speak to that experience at all? If you'd feel comfortable like sharing any of your own stories with that disconnection, or maybe some of your colleague stories that you've heard of other veterans?
Sure. I think that brings up two things for me. One is this notion of tribe that veterans have, because it's a very close bond, and it's the thing that they miss the most when they leave the military, and it makes it so much harder for them to re-engage in a space where they maybe don't see that same level of intimacy, that same level of commitment. We mentioned purpose earlier, that we don't see what the purpose is, that people are really believe in something strongly enough to die for that, not only that thing, but for the other people that they're with. Which is not unique to military organizations, but it certainly is a quality that just about every military organization has, that sense of deep commitment. Sebastian Junger wrote about that. He was not a military veteran, but he was a journalist who was embedded with troops, and he spent quite a lot of time with them and came to understand them in a way that veterans, even today, when you tell a group of veterans it's having a meeting and that Sebastian Junger is going to be there and he's going to talk, they'll all show up because they have a great deal of respect that he gets that.
Yeah.
He understands where they're coming from. So the other corollary to that closeness, and again, that's the question is, do we need to learn from that? Do we need to try to recreate that? And then there's something of a dark side to that too. So that brings up the issue of moral injury, which is not something that's talked about probably outside of the psychology community at all. And even veterans have difficult time talking about it. What veterans tend to talk about is post-traumatic stress. In other words, I've been in combat. We've had difficult things happen. Regardless of what those difficult things are, this is a lot of violence going on, a lot of unanticipated harm that's going on, a lot of quote unquote collateral damage that is deeply unsettling. So when we start sorting through all of that, in the end, the question is, what we do, was it necessary? Was it in keeping with our values? Was it for a purpose? And did everybody do their part? And we're starting to see now that veterans are coming back with stories that they really can't share. When you talk about untold stories, a lot of those stories are about incidents that we would recognize as a moral injury. And those tend to sort out into two different categories. One is the moral injury where we did not fulfill our purpose. We did not fulfill our mission. Somehow we came up short. And then now there's guilt and shame that come as feelings with that until those issues are resolved in some way. And the sharing it with the sharing responsibility that Terry mentioned is really an important part of that healing. And I think a lot of the work some good work with, that the VA and other organizations have been doing in the contemporary space with veterans have worked on that piece of absolving that. And the other kind of moral injury is a betrayal. Those are a little harder. That's where the system that put us where we are somehow didn't do the right thing. The people who were in charge didn't do the right thing. There were horrendous consequences for that. We have a strong movement in the veteran community now around the damage done to our Afghan partners, as an example, for us as a country, deciding we weren't going to stay involved there anymore. And the way that we did it, which was it was experienced, it was felt by veterans that had friends who were Afghan nationals we had shared purpose with them, and all of a sudden now we're not going to be there for you anymore. And a lot of those veterans have actually gone back and engaged in different ways to try to heal that. But those are some examples of what could be classified as a moral injury that are probably a part of a lot of veteran stories, and somehow the broader audience, for whatever reason, it's not penetrating through the sound bites. It's not penetrating through the conventional means to understand what that means for all of us.
Yeah. One of the quotes that stuck with me that you're making me think of again is that one of the veterans in your sample was talking about when you are serving, you're just following orders. And then when you return home, you're kind of just waiting for your next order, and it never comes. And I thought that was a really fascinating way to put it and helped me to understand. That made sense to me. And again, I appreciate, the language. And like you said, how you've seen so many of these veterans to be so articulate about their experience, because it does help to create that connection that felt like an understanding moment, a kind of like aha moment for me of like, oh, of course, that makes so much sense that would be a real challenge. And what does it look like then to respond to that? And I think that's part of the question you all seem to be asking is, okay, we've identified an issue, a disconnect, something that we could be all doing better. We could be showing up better for each other. And then what does that actually look like to show up for each other in a new, connected kind of way? And I think the question that I'm kind of left with, which, Terry, you touched on earlier, that you were part of anti-war protests. And, I think many different people can have many different feelings about war and whatnot. But I wonder, the question that keeps lingering for me is how, I guess I have two different ways to ask it. How can I be, anti-war without being anti-veterans or anti the people who serve? And then just a flip side way of asking that is, how can I be pro-veterans? How can I support veterans and the people who serve without supporting war and violence and unnecessary pain?
Well, for some reason, this metaphor of the way that we are now having a more nuanced conversation in this country about our relationship with policing comes to mind. And there are some areas of similarity, but there are also some huge differences between military operations and police work. But the work of Paul Chappell that Terry mentioned earlier comes into mind. How do we use these ideas that come from the military practice, military leadership, military literature, military ways of being, particularly Sun Tzu? How do we use those to create peace? And if you read enough of it, you see that the objective of any very good and seasoned military commander is to not fight. It's to achieve your goal, which is to stay not fighting through convincing people who maybe would like to fight with you that it just wouldn't be worthwhile at all to do that, and that there are better ways to engage. And Paul's shown how much we rely on order, discipline, these things that are part of military culture as part of our daily lives, but we don't see them as that because they're invisible. It's like water. We walk down the street taking for granted that somebody's not going to randomly take a pot shot at us or just, come up and take something out of our pocket just because we're there. We have conventions in society that say we don't do those things. And then when we start removing, I think Barnett Pierce used to refer to these as good constraints to action. So not all actions are good ones. And we start removing the good constraints, then we start seeing what could be a situation that we don't want to be a part of. We don't want to even envision being a part of. So I think appreciating what this force is I think somebody else made the comment along the lines that nobody is born a veteran, right? Everybody comes to serve because of that. That's a trajectory of their life. It's of choices they make in their life that they want to do that. And usually those choices are based on wanting to serve. It's based on wanting to be a part of something greater than yourself. And so those are good forces. And as we reimagine, I guess, our relationship with soldiers, with members of the military, and how they are part of a society. And this is where Cosmopolis comes in.
Yeah.
How are we all affected by that, even if we are all not participants in the direct actions of it? How do we all play a part into this broader social system that creates this peace and prosperity and this togetherness, and as Alfred Adler would say, the social feeling of being together that we all really want at a very deep level.
Terry, what would you say about the tangible ways for us to find that connection?
Well, I think that really what we're talking about, and I think what the film's purpose is to open these conversations. I think that we don't talk about this, as I started with, we don't know veterans very well because it's easy for lots of all the reasons we've been talking about to be separated. And so I think that conversation, bridging that gap, taking that civilian responsibility, I think is a very important conversation. I also think that the conversation that you and Bart are talking about now about war is a very important conversation that we don't really have. I mean, we're living in a country now that doesn't really vote on whether we go to war. We haven't voted in Congress on whether we're going to war. We don't even call them wars. We call them actions. I mean, at one point, one of the veterans in the retreat said, and somebody told me about something we're doing in Africa. What are we doing in Africa? It was, what are we doing in Africa? I mean, we don't even know. So I think, and I also think that, as I said, and with the film As If They Were Angels, that World War II story seemed and felt like a very different story from the sense of it being very purposeful. People get called upon to do things, but if the only way that we do these things is with military actions, then we end up in a situation, for example, Ukraine right now, it looks like World War II. It's bombs and tanks, and we should have alternative ways to decide what we do about conflicts and issues that threaten the world. I'm not saying they don't threaten the world, and I'm not being Pollyanna that we will always avoid conflicts, but I think our conversations around them, our sense of alternatives is very limited. The situation in Afghanistan, the way we left, I just think that's a really good example of what is problematic in having so few ways to deal with conflict, to be skilled and to be ready to engage in so few ways. And I think that's why this idea of waging peace is very important. Paul also has literally developed a curriculum for kids in schools, for colleges, for adults, which he calls peace literacy, which is addressing different ways, alternative ways to deal with aggression, to deal with violence, to deal with conflict in a world where we have school shootings all the time. This is very important. All of these things are very important for a lot of different reasons. This is going very broad, but the reality is that, like Cosmopolis, which is envisioning a whole different society and with some sense of the way to get there, right? these conversations are important for us to be having to get anywhere other than where we are now. And so I think, the Surgeon General making a statement that we are a country of, how do he put it? Basically, that we're a country of isolation, that we are a country of disconnection. And there is one part of the quote which resonated with some of the veterans a lot. Rebuilding social connection must be a top public health priority for our nation. It will require reorienting ourselves, our communities, and our institutions to prioritize human connection and healthy relationships. I mean, that's the person who is in charge of the national health. So, I think we see this in a very precise and concise way among veterans. Another example was I went to a film, another documentarian had done something about veterans, and there was a Q&A afterwards with a panel of veterans. And there was a woman who said, I kind of had the best you can expect. I came back and I had some people helping me get work, and I got a job in a big corporation, and it was a good paying job. And I stepped in, to this with every reason to feel like, okay, I had really gotten where I needed to be. And she said, and nobody had each other's backs. Nobody was looking out for the other guy in any way at all. Everybody was out for themselves and scrambling to get someplace. If they had to scramble over somebody to get there, they would do it. And this goes back to Bart's statement about tribe and Sebastian Unger's work. She said, I had to quit because it was so unhealthy. Now, she's coming from that veteran world of connection and tribe and, community, which is powerful among veterans. But my thought when she said that was, that's not healthy for any of us. The fact that we walk into those jobs all the time and don't feel like that's somehow not the way it has to be says something about us that at this point in time is making it difficult in our own culture. With suicides, which veteran suicide rates have been over the top for a long time. Now people are talking about young people's suicides in America, and on and on and on. The parallels go on. And I just think we have to recognize these, the need for some of this rethinking and some of this conversation and some of this sense of interconnection. I think one of the things you mentioned in watching As If They Were Angels, the impulse again to look away.
Yeah.
And my dad used to say this. My dad was obviously one of the rescued in that film. And he used to say that what the Newfoundlanders who came out and saved all the American sailors from this disaster, or saved at least nearly half, they were interdependent. They lived in small fishing communities at the edge of the continent, really.
Yeah.
They were interdependent. Everything they did, they needed the community to make it all work. So when there was a disaster off their shore, they did what they would have done for any of them, which is go out together and do what they had to do to save lives, regardless of who the lives were. They certainly didn't know any of those people. And so that interdependence, just like the tribe that Bart was talking about, is an important piece of humanity. And, losing it sometimes may look like liberation. I don't think that's what it pans out to be. I think the interdependence and the interconnection is life-giving. So I think that's the story that needs to be told.
direct the next question at you first, because I know that you have lots of other work that you've done with veterans and the stories and taking this communication perspective. So I'm curious about your answers to these questions in terms of what now in this project you're working on now, but also your other work. What is challenging about the work that you do with veterans and storytelling, but also what is meaningful about it?
Boy, those things are wrapped up pretty tightly together.
Yeah,
what's
I imagine.
challenging and what's meaningful is the things that need to be done.
Yeah.
And that makes them challenging. They are, again, what Barnett Pierce and Vern Cronin might have called wicked problems. They're so complex, and the complexity is what makes it hard for traditional thinking, traditional institutions to go ahead and make a change. I had one of my Marine veterans, and again, I want to bring some of those voices in because they respond to these things, in really interesting ways. And one, we were talking about how do you manage change in a military organization, because they value tradition among other things. They're also very pragmatic, so that there's something that gives them an advantage, they will embrace it. But one of my Marine officers said, the style of organizational change we have in the Marine Corps is the leaders come in and say, stop doing that, start doing this. And that's one way to create change, but another way is to understand what you're making together. And we've talked again with some of the CMM models in what makes a difference, and we have particularly found it to be helpful in the concept of resilience in terms of military members who are called to operate and interoperate in across cultures. And I think there's some very hopeful signs that are going on in the military and veteran space. One is the shift of our national strategy from, we tend to look at enemies and friends, and that's not always maybe the best way to look at the world. But the shift in the way the military operates with others, we're realizing that globally we're more interconnected than we've ever been, and that will have to be the case going forward, even more so than it has been. So the shift has been to creating alliances and strengthening alliances, and part of that is intercultural competency, and it also helps to prevent some of the things we have seen happen as moral injuries that are unintended consequences that happen when we have an intercultural misunderstanding. An action that was not intended as hostility is interpreted as such, and the reaction is then not anything anybody wanted. So that area of we work on military training and how do we create a stronger capacity for intercultural competency, which means the communication, the interaction piece. Since we're not coming from the same shared understandings always, we put more emphasis on those coordinating elements. And how do we continue to operate and get things done when these little red flags come up where the cultural alignment isn't necessarily getting the job done for us. The other thing I think that I heard mentioned is this notion of when these unintended consequences. Again, Vern Cronin and Barnett Pierce had a little model in CMM that maybe didn't become the most prevalent one, but it was called the URP, the unwanted repetitive pattern, which basically is something that you get people together in a certain context, and then things we don't want to happen. And one of our former past year CMM Institute fellows, Darren Murray, did a study of URPs, and he found there were some interesting characteristics. One is the lack of potential alternatives. So in other words, if we don't see more than the world in more than black and white, if we don't see a range and a palette of things that we can do together that are in betwixt and between, and the utility of that gives us a greater likelihood that things we don't want to have happen will happen. And then the other two, there's actually six, but there are three that stand out for me, and that's one is this lack of alternatives. Another one is contextual force is playing an inordinate amount. In other words, we feel like we're wearing this uniform, we're in this environment, this happens over here, I've got to do this.
Yeah.
That is a URP producing dynamic. And then the last one is an over reliance of emotionality. And I think that's why you see in military culture over the years, at different times, there's a great deal of emphasis placed on mental discipline. It's a literature called Stoicism. How do we keep those emotions from driving our actions? And so that I think the trick is not to make it completely go over to logic, because the forces of logic don't always get us there either. And so we look at this middle space and this ability to be flexible, this ability to also listen and co-create the reality going forward. I'm hearing that come out of the psychologists now. I wasn't hearing that 2 or 3 years ago. I just had a panel last week with a couple of fairly prominent VA psychologists, and they're talking more about integrative strategies and also about how do we have the capacity for veterans to co-create, first and primary, their own post-military life.
Yeah.
How do they fit in? Not just, okay, pick another alternative. If you're not going to be this, we're going to put another suit on you and you're going to go be that. They maybe don't want to get into that again. The old song by The Who, we don't get fooled again. If something didn't work, we're not going to necessarily just unquestioningly go in that direction again. We need to find our place so we're a part of something, but we're finding it in a dynamic way, not in a just kind of a take this off and put that on. Stop doing this, start doing that.
Well, just one of the things that brought to mind that I think is really an important part of this in terms of the additional conversations and what Bart's talking about alternatives, which I think are what we would hopefully come up with if we had more conversations, more open conversation about this and connection around those conversations. So there's, engagement on all sides. But I think this idea of service is something that has been just kind of dismissed many times. It's not like it hasn't come up. Obviously, we have the Peace Corps, we have, Teach for America. There are things like this, and people engage in them. But I think one of the things that came from the Veterans Retreat was this sense, first of all, that veterans want to continue to serve. Several of the veterans referenced, we serve, it's in our blood. We want to continue to do that. That urge to serve is significant and meaningful and authentic. But the idea that how much easier it would be for veterans to return to a culture that did have more emphasis on purpose,
right,
and emphasis on service. If they came home and they, and one of the veterans, Joel, makes a comment about this. If we came home and, we were coming back to a country where people had served, maybe not necessarily military service, but had served and understood what that was, and not just the understanding of it, but the impact of the experience of serving. If we all served in some way in our society, how different of a culture, a society would we be? I would guess tremendously different, because we all know what it feels like to live a period of our time, our life, in service to something bigger than ourselves. And so, I think that needs to be part of this conversation about alternatives,
Yeah.
and those, include, we've talked about a lot of inclusion there, but I think service is a big part of it, and it certainly connects to that humanity piece that we talked about, and to alternatives to war. There's anyway. It's important, and I think it's time. I'm hoping it's time for us to really have these conversations.
I really like that point. You've both, used the word integration in this conversation, and that feels like just like a little bit, crack the door, just, kind of get an inch into this conversation for people who really don't know veterans or haven't heard their stories. And so I think the, first step into kind of what I'd call complicating the narrative, or, starting to hear this story, is to think in terms of integration, because I think in a very simplistic way, the way that, to use kind of the language you both use, citizens relate to veterans is, I'd say, a lot of pity and just not understanding of what the reality of that experience was like, because as you've mentioned, we don't ask, or we ask the wrong questions in insensitive ways. And it's interesting to think that, it's kind of like dismissive of people's experience in the military, and then saying, come back to, the civilian world where everything is great. And of course you would want to be in this world, but we can kind of humble ourselves to say, well, there's things that are not perfect about our world too. Yes, we're not, serving in war, but what can we take from the peace that we experience at home, but also, like you said, the beauty of things like service and purpose, and these things that veterans have, learned from their experiences and really integrate, instead of, you just forget about that and come do our way of being, which is disconnected and isolated. So it's integration, and kind of using that as a perspective feels like at least a good first step in for people to start reconceptualizing these stories. I like what you said earlier, the quote from the Surgeon General about really framing this as a public health issue. And again, making it really everybody's issue. It affects everybody. As we wrap up a little bit, I just want to spend a few more minutes with both of you. I've really appreciated this whole conversation already, but I just want to invite you again to say any last things that you want to leave us with before we do wrap up.
I just, I have to say that I think Bart would agree. It took us a long time to get to a focus that was really meaningful, in part because there are films out there about veterans. There are stories out there about veterans. And so, what do you say that adds to the conversation, that adds something meaningful? And so I think that the journey it's taken us a bit, but I think that where we are now with everything that we've been talking about is just kind of a very significant moment to bring these stories out, to let people see and hear the faces and the heart and the difficulties, the conundrum of being a veteran returning. And it's not all about combat vets. They're trained no matter what they actually do. I'm not saying it's all the same, but it definitely is all creates a disconnect, a difficulty to reintegrate, to be integrated. And so, so I guess what I'm saying is I'm just very glad that we're here, that we're talking about this, and that we have the opportunity, because of these incredible veterans who allowed us in, to let them tell their stories and to let them connect to audience out there, and to have that happen on hopefully, film can be an emotional medium, and it is talking and hearing and seeing, but it also provides the opportunity for a lot of heart.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's where we go.
Yeah, to add to that, one of the things that I guess we're talking about a little bit of a preview of what the film might be. So one of the questions I would want to throw out to the audience in our podcast is, where do you think an audience could be found? How do we reach that audience with the sort of things that we're talking about that would create space for the kinds of conversations that we're describing here that we want to have? And we have been talking about this for however long we've been working on this project, which is this something that we designed to be shown on college campuses as we think about political issues, global security. So that's part of the issue, is that there are a lot of people talking about those things, but they're in isolated pockets. So there are geeks about national security, there are geeks about international relations, there are geeks about peace building, and we really want to get this into the broader sphere, so that we can create more space for a conversation that really is transformative of what we've been doing. Is how do we do this better together in a way that reflects our values and our intentions and our purpose in a way that we can all agree that we share. Making a small segue, one of the things that we have had a conversation about internally in the military psychology program at Adler is the intersectionality, to use a good word, for this purpose, between the military members' experience and families. We don't usually say military and families, but it's understood in the military community the family is part of the service commitment that an individual makes. So how do we have this address this intersectionality between military family being isolated and other groups that are marginalized in our population who are feeling not included, not a part of it? And so we've learned a lot, I think, from having DEI type of conversations in and around the military. Military members see the things that civilian communities get worked up about as being less of an issue, but they see things that people are not paying attention to as being more of an issue. For example, race is not the main issue of division within the military. It's everybody wears the same uniform, everybody subscribes to the same values to a certain degree. There's at least an overlap enough that people, they would turn around and say, that person is my brother or sister, that person's got my back. Doesn't make any difference what color they are, what gender they are, any other difference that might exist. But there are some important things that could be changed within the military culture that would, for example, bring in more collaboration across difference than just what we have. What we have in the military is a very much an industrial age specialization, right? We have people that are trained to operate electronic equipment. We have people that are trained to use weaponry. There are people that are trained to gather intelligence and interpret that. So we're still a little fragmented along those lines, and maybe there's some things that we could learn as well. But the conversation is a different one. I think it's a very hopeful thing. One of the things we were asked in a reunion format with the Navy a couple of months ago, some of us folks who have been out of uniform for quite a while are wanting to know what's going on in the military culture. So I think that's one, hopeful that the young folks are figuring it out. And second is we need to maybe learn a little bit from that too.
Also, I would add to Bart kind of opened this up with, where are the audiences? We, as I said, part of our sample is limited by the fact that that's what we have on video at this point. That's what we've shot. And so there is much more to do. And we're very engaged with different groups and organizations that are making the effort to bring civilians and veterans together in a significant and effective way can bring civilians and military and veterans together. But we are interested in those programs. So if your audience has thoughts or ideas about where that's happening, where there is a significant coming together of veterans and civilians in a way that is having that kind of impact, that would be wonderful for us to know about, because we can go anywhere, but we can't know about everywhere.
Yes. Yes, that's good. And I appreciate that, because part of our conversation, I think we've been dancing around, is how do we engage people in just their real lives and relationships, but also how can we engage people more directly with this project that is, yes, still in the middle of being developed and has potential and possibilities and openness to find something meaningful. So yes, that's good. The invitation is extended for everyone to help keep bringing this project to life. And I'll be excited to see what the final result ends up being. And I appreciate you all sharing what you have with me already.
Thank you very much for doing this. It's very meaningful to me. I know it is to Bart, and it's part of beginning this conversation.
Yeah,
all of it. So thank you very much for opening that door.
It has been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Bart and Terry. I'm so glad you were able to join us for this very meaningful episode. The questions I would have you keep in mind as you reflect on part 1 and part 2 of this conversation are the ones that I have written out at the top of the show notes. They are: what does it look like to show up for each other in newly connected ways? How can we reorient ourselves to prioritize human connection and relationships? And then how can we break out of unwanted repetitive patterns by engaging in conversations that open us up to alternatives we may never have considered? I think these are good things to take away from our conversation today, as much of our conversation did center around kind of acknowledging that the patterns we're in now are maybe not serving us in the best way, not serving our veterans, not serving our stories in the best way. But that if we can create the space for conversation, then maybe that in and of itself could generate new ideas about how we can get connected to each other. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, and as Terry and Bart talked about, their project is still a work in progress, and they'd love for you to be involved in any way that you can. So you can reach out to me in all the usual ways, through email, through the website, and through Instagram and YouTube. If you want to get connected to them, I'd be happy to connect you. As always, I am supported by the CMM Institute. This podcast is one of many initiatives that tries to help us create that better social world we're working towards. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.